Hello students, this is Professor McDonald. This will be my comments for Chapter 13, which is property crimes. This is a pretty long chapter. I'm going to try to do my best to reduce my comments so this tape doesn't go on too long. Most of you are pretty familiar with these concepts and with the different crimes that we're going to talk about. If you work in criminal investigation, I promise you're going to investigate every one of these. I know I have. I've investigated everything from stolen toolboxes to stolen M16 rifles to stolen postal money orders, cash shipments. I've worked multiple different fraud cases, from credit card fraud to insurance fraud to major money laundering complex fraud cases. So I can promise you that you will get involved in these type of crimes. As a matter of fact, property crimes are the predominant crimes that do occur. And they're also many times the most difficult to solve, especially burglaries and car break-ins, crimes of that nature. Property crimes are committed for the perpetrator's personal gain. This is a little bit of chapter overview. These crimes include burglary, theft and fraud. Although burglary by definition is the entering of a structure for the purpose of committing felony or theft therein, the crime of burglary is almost predominantly a crime wherein the object of the crime is the breaking and entering of a structure for the purpose of committing a theft. There are professional and amateur burglars, but the cycle of burglary for both includes the need to conduct the burglary, the opportunity to do the burglary, the means, and the means could be the tools they need to break in, the satisfaction of conducting a burglary, and the choice. They weigh the options as to what, whether it's a business or a resident, which house they want to burglarize. There are many targets for burglars. As you can imagine, it could be a teenager just trying to break in a house to steal cash, to a professional burglar. We had rings of professional burglars when I was a post office that would go into post offices, burglarize the post office, and either torch the safe to get to the contents or steal the entire safe, drag it out of the building, and haul it away. There are many, but the means to investigate a burglary examines the means of gaining entry, what the burglar did while in the premises, and how they exited the premises. So these are the key factors that you're going to investigate when you work these cases. Now, very quickly, theft is the trespassery taking and carrying away a personal property belonging to another with the intent to deprive the owner of such property permanently. Pretty simple. If I see a bicycle on the side of a house and I walk up and I steal it and ride it away, well, I'm carrying it away and I'm intending to keep it permanently. Time is in the favor of the thief, and the items stolen are clues for investigators as the modus operandi, the MO. Those are important to investigate. And of course, the real success in stealing is disposing of the stolen property. So people steal things for a reason. Maybe it's for personal use, but a lot of times it's to sell the property to convert it to cash. Auto theft is a form of larceny if a person is not in the vehicle at the time it is stolen. And what they mean there is if somebody walks up to a car at a stoplight, pulls a gun on you, and forces you out of the car and then steals your car, we're talking about a carjacking, which is a much more personal crime. And then theft by employees. I've worked many of those cases, and organized retail theft are also important property crimes. And when we're talking about organized retail theft, we're talking about organized gangs that go into large department stores and steal merchandise. Now, fraud is a nonviolent crime. It involves elements of intentional deceit, concealment, corruption, misrepresentation, and abuse of trust to gain the property of another. Fraud's on the increase. There are different types of fraud. You have con games, you have bank examiner fraud, Recently, if you noticed in the news, there was some fraud carried out by employees of Wells Fargo Bank, opening up fraudulent bank accounts and actually diverting funds. I worked multiple cases when I was in Alabama. I had a good relationship with Blue Cross and Blue Shield, and they had employees that worked in claims that they identified as being involved in fraud, and they would refer those cases to me, and we prosecuted many of them in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And these would be employees that would set up false accounts and false claims and then generate monies normally they would set up a post office box in a post office somewhere that they controlled to send the checks to. So this is where you have an employee within the company that's actually stealing from the company. You have workplace fraud. This could be workers' compensation cases where people fake injury, that sort of thing, so they can get paid compensation. And then ATM fraud. And then today we have computer fraud. So there's a lot of different types of fraud. Insurance fraud is one of the things I worked on heavily. I even had a case once where a guy faked his own death. He had taken out a $1 million insurance policy and faked his own death and tried to disappear, but we were able to resolve the case. Now let's go back to burglary real quick. I've talked about it already. The three essential elements are entry of a building or a structure with the intent to steal or commit another felony. So if you break into a building to rape a woman, that's also a burglary. If the rape occurs, you also have a burglary that you can charge. But most of the time, burglars go into a building to steal something. It's an opportunist crime. If it's an unoccupied building, obviously the chance of getting caught are less. Now there's different levels of burglary too. And if you actually break into a building and burglarize a building when there are people there in the building, in most states, you have, how you have first degree, second degree murder, well, you have different levels also of burglary that a person could be charged with. They have first, second, and third degree burglary. And of course, there's great danger in that because there's been many occasions when a burglar burglarized a occupied dwelling, and when detected, they resorted to violence and many times murdered the occupant of the building. So burglary can easily advance itself into a murder depending on the circumstances. And again, you got professional burglars who work, who identify particular buildings. Maybe they like to break into drugstores because they want access to the drugs, the prescription drugs. Maybe they hit professional buildings. I told you we used to have we had many cases of burglary at post offices to steal cash and stamps and money orders, whatever they get their hands on. And sometimes these were professional rings. And then you have amateurs who just primarily commit the crime to secure money for drugs. Different types of entry. They could use a tool to force open a door or a window. Use a credit card. Some people are skilled at using credit cards to defeat a locking system. I've seen them break in through the roof, through skylights, through air conditioning ducts. I've seen cases where people will actually hide in a premises, and when the store closes, they're inside. And then they break out, cut holes through walls or ceilings, or come up through the basement. So there's your imagination, anything you can imagine can happen with the crime of burglary as far as the means to enter the building. And many times, the reason for burglaries are for profit, obviously, buy drugs, or even, like I said before, break into a building to rape a woman. And there's some of your professional burglars that target safes. There's different methods of attacking safes, punching, hammer and drift punch. I'm not going to read all. It's peeling off the surface of the safe door, ripping it, drilling it. I've seen them all. And sometimes they'll even burn it, try to burn through the outer exterior to get into the inner contents. And they can even go as far as using explosives. And remember, these are key elements of your investigation for a burglary investigator, because you want to be able to establish the means of gaining entry. And there's evidence to be collected. If they use tools, there's tool mark impressions. Even something as simple as a screwdriver that's used to pry open a door will leave an impression. You can collect those impressions through evidence collection techniques. And if you identify a suspect and you collect his toolbox, say for example, you seize his toolbox, the laboratory can actually match up a screwdriver with a pry entry mark. I've seen it done. You can get fingerprints at crime scenes. I made a burglary once, a case where the guy had pried open the, I was an NCIS agent, and somebody had broken into the chaplain's office to steal money after hours, and I actually pulled off fingerprints off the outer sill of the window where they gained entry, and we were able to match it up to our suspect and get a conviction. And so we're going to look at those things. We're also going to look at how they left the scene. And these are all things that help the investigator and things that can be collected. So make sure you read about the different type of burglars and in doing burglary investigations, some of the key elements, key methods, things that you have to establish as the investigator as you move forward in the investigation. But that means of gaining entry, what they did while inside, and how they exited the premises, those are all key elements of your investigation. There's also people that are professional burglars, like we talked about. They're known burglars. So whenever there's a series of burglaries, they might have a particular signature, a method in which they like to enter and leave, and what they do inside. Maybe they're jewelry thieves. And so a lot of police departments' intelligence files do contain information on past burglaries. So these are things that you need to access while doing these type of investigations. And of course, with the use of cameras today, many times you'll get the burglar on camera. Now, theft is pretty simple. It's the unlawful taking or stealing of property without the use of force or violence to deprive the owner permanently of their property. So you don't have an element of force or violence here with a theft case. If somebody pulls a gun on somebody and steals their necklace, it's not a larceny. That is a robbery. It's a whole different animal. So, and a different crime. So make sure you understand those distinctions. In the textbook, they talk about household larceny, personal crimes, personal larceny. I mean, something like you leave your, you walk out of the classroom, say for example, and you leave your cell phone or you leave your pocketbook or your wallet or whatever, or even your textbooks in the room, and you forget, and you come back 5-10 minutes later and they're gone. Well, that's a larceny. That's a personal crime. Somebody stole your items and they meant to permanently deprive you of them. And normally what they'll do is they'll probably try to sell it to get money. There's a very good chart on page 243 on the investigation of thefts from the attack to the post scene, continuing the investigation, lead development. Are we dealing with a series of thefts? Many times that's what occurs. Just like you have individuals that rob banks or they rob 7-Elevens, many times thieves operate in the same manner. And then you would identify your suspects, make an arrest, and file case preparation and prosecution as in other crimes. Now, it is also important to understand that many times, once you establish that method of operation, you do have intelligence files, and talking to your other detectives and other investigators that can help. And the property stolen is a major clue. It's a major lead to follow up on. Maybe it's a credit card. They steal a credit card, well, what are they going to do with it? They're going to use it. That's going to generate a lot of leads for you. If they do use it, you're better off, to be honest with you, because they'll use it somewhere, maybe to get gas or maybe buy something at a department store. And these are leads that you can follow up in the identification of a suspect. They'll also take items that are resaleable and sell them to individuals who deal in stolen property. Another good lead is is pawn shops. A lot of pawn shops work very closely with the police, and if you have a series of items that are stolen that you can identify, and that's one of the hard things of these investigations, a lot of time these are items that actually are difficult to positively identify as connected to the defendant. Like, for example, a gold necklace. Well, how do you know that's her gold necklace unless there's some kind of marking on it, that sort of thing. That's why the police always tell people to, put some sort of identification mark on property in your home in case you get burglarized. Now, we know with televisions you have serial numbers, things of that nature. So if you do have personal property, you need to keep a list of the serial numbers, and those are very useful to investigators when they investigate these type of crimes, because they can if they do recover some items, they can positively connect them to your items that were stolen. And also that goes a long way in making a case where the offender can be prosecuted. And again, high-end thieves, say that steal art and jewelry, many times they have connections with organized crime. I worked on a major theft case at the airports years ago, and they were stealing large quantities of credit cards. Back in those days, they were shipping these things, and they would steal them from large containers of mail, and they might get a couple hundred credit cards in one package, say, for example. And these things would start showing up within 24 hours over in Europe being used. We're talking Visa, MasterCard, American Express. So with the world we live in today, these sophisticated organized crime thieves have a global outreach. So it's not unusual to see these things, items like credit cards and credit card numbers. They can be used overseas within a short time after the theft. But these all are leads that are generated, things that you have to follow up that'll help you identify who the culprit is. Criminal intelligence plays a key role in investigations. And if you work in a police department or you work for a federal agency like I did, we all work closely together. In a major police department, you might have a property crime team that works burglaries and thefts and fraud. You might have a personal crime team that works robberies, rapes, and homicides. Or even break it down, you could have a robbery team. In the agencies that I worked with, as a postal inspector, we had internal crime. These were guys that worked employee theft, workers' compensation fraud. We had external crime. We worked armed robberies, burglaries, mail bombs, drugs through the mail. So these things are broken down, but the key thing is everybody works together. And as we work together, we're always talking with our co-workers about possible suspects in cases. And so when you do work these investigations and you develop a good intelligence file, your chance, if you work together closely, your chances of resolving cases it's much greater. And that includes working with other agencies as well. Keeping good reports, using field interview reports, have good intelligence, police record systems. These things all go hand in hand in helping the investigators solve cases. And sometimes it could be the smallest thing. If you ever read about the Son of Sam killings back in the 1970s in New York, this guy was going around shooting couples in their cars. He murdered multiple people. And that case was actually solved by good police work. In the area of a shooting, somebody pulled traffic tickets to see who maybe was illegally parked during the time of the shootings. And that traffic, they identified several traffic tickets where people had been unlawfully parked and gotten a ticket during that time period. And that actually led to the apartment of the suspect, called the Son of Sam. And he turned out to be a postal worker, but that's a very simple lead that probably saved many lives, because his Berkowitz was his name. Berkowitz, his crime spree stopped after he was targeted, identified, and arrested. Just remember, people that steal, they're repeaters. They're going to repeat their crime. They're going to keep stealing until they get caught. And the disposal of property that's the ultimate goal, to dispose of it and make a profit. So you do have receivers in stolen property, and these are individuals that that purchase items they know are stolen, and they turn around and sell them too. So there's multiple people. It could be multiple people involved in it. They're called fences, or the intermediaries of larceny. They buy and sell stolen property. One of the proactive techniques that have been used, and I've seen it, our agencies used it, was storefronts or sting operations, where police investigators pose as fences for the purposes of buying stolen property. And so these are techniques that I've seen work and are still used today. In other words, you would set up a storefront, and the word would get out on the street, maybe through informants or whatever, that if you've got stolen property, this is the place to bring it to. And under controlled circumstances, videotaping, undercover officers would operate the storefront and identify the thieves that are coming in there. So it's a fun thing to do also as well. Let's move on to auto theft. Different types of auto theft. I'm not going to read all of them. The joyriding juvenile, they steal a car just to take a ride. You have strippers and dismantlers. They steal high-end cars to strip them down and sell the parts. Professional auto thieves, they steal late-model automobiles and resell them. Some of these cars end up being shipped overseas to Mexico, South America, or other destinations throughout the world. Some of them are just used as chop shops, where they chop up the parts. The parts are very, very valuable, and a lot of money can be made, especially from high-end cars. Carjacking is the armed robbery of a person in possession of an automobile, and I think I mentioned that earlier. And of course, in an automobile theft investigation, the good thing is you do have leads. You have if the vehicle has been licensed, if you have a VIN number, vehicle identification number, the color of the vehicle, these sort of things, a bolting can be put out, and hopefully, the early stages of the investigation, you have the best chances of actually recovering the car and identifying a thief. But nonetheless, if the recovery isn't made quickly, these are cases that can be resolved. Hopefully, if the vehicle doesn't end up in a chop shop or somewhere like that, and then once that occurs, or if it gets shipped out of the country, it makes your cases much more difficult to solve. But the reality of auto theft is the current high prices for vehicle accessories and components can contribute to the growth of hot parts dealer. And when we mean hot, I mean stolen parts dealers. The auto industry will work with you closely in trying to resolve these investigations. Employee theft is a big thing. When I was a postal inspector, we spent a lot of time because these were government employees that were entrusted with large funds of money orders, things of value, and so a lot of work was done in identifying and arresting employees that were involved in theft. Most of you have worked in jobs where money is handled. You know what loss prevention is about. I shouldn't have to tell you about that. Employee theft, especially in the retail business, that's their number one loss of merchandise. The term is called shrinkage. That's a term I want you to remember. Shrinkage is the term that businesses use for the loss of inventory from employee theft. And of course, all companies want to reduce shrinkage because that affects the bottom line of profit. And they talk about three different types, and I'll let you read that yourself within the textbook. Incidental. And this could be where the employees consume the employer's product while on the job, or they take it home, such as pens and pencils, or even eat the food, I guess. Situational theft and continual theft. And continual theft involves ongoing, constant acts of theft by an employee. And it could be the need to support a vice, gambling, drugs, or whatever. And I've seen all of these types. Obviously, the continuous thief is the one you want to identify quickly because that's the one that's going to have the most impact. You also have organized retail theft. This is a big push today. These are organized gangs of individuals that go into retail organizations. They steal, then they fence the material. Where can they fence it? At flea markets. They can sell it through individuals and fences, and it's a big industry. Cargo theft is another major industry, and this could be something as simple as stealing large packages to something as stealing the entire truck or hijacking a truck, especially ones that are unattended. One of the good things today is they have a lot of the companies put GPS in those trucks, and the thieves, sometimes that truck, if it's stolen and if it's reported quickly, they can track it pretty quickly and have a better chance of recovery. But thieves know this as well, organized cargo thieves. And so that they might haul off a trailer, place it in an isolated area, and just observe it from a distance to see if the police show up. Investigation of fraud. What are the elements of fraud? Criminal intent, wrongful objective, disguise or concealment of the objective, and reliance on victims' carelessness or compassion. Basically, in fraud, you're trying to steal something through the use of deception. In other words, fraud is a nonviolent crime involving elements of intentional deceit, concealment, corruption, misrepresentation, abuse of trust to gain the property of another. The criminal intent is the mens rea, that's the guilty mind. And there's different types of frauds. There's some interesting ones. You're actually going to do an exercise. I want you to read those on bunco schemes and con games and the pigeon drop and charity switches. I'm not going to read all these to you. The carnival bunco, I got victimized by one of those guys when I was about 20 years old. Playing the games that they tell you that you're going to win and you're never going to win. And then it can be up to sophisticated bank examiner fraud. I told you about the Blue Cross Blue Shield fraud that I worked on. There's some fraud in the news with Wells Fargo. You have fraudulent checks. You have people that steal people's checks. You have forged checks. You have people that create checks. They steal the account numbers and they create checks that appear to even be business checks. I've worked a lot of those cases. Very profitable. People that write bad checks, non-sufficient fund checks. And of course, credit card fraud is a very big business in the world today. They don't have to have the card itself if they got the number. And so these are all things that you will get engaged in as a criminal investigator. And there's a lot of, I'm not going to read all these, but a lot of different consumer and business fraud. I want you to look at those. Home improvement fraud, advance fee fraud, land sale frauds. I mean, even like we're going through a hurricane now. People will file fraudulent claims saying that they had damage on their homes that they never had. Workplace fraud is big, and that could be embezzlement, which is the conversion of another's property over which the thief has custody or control. And as a postal inspector, we worked a lot of embezzlement cases with employees that would steal money orders or steal cash from their drawer or steal cash from customers. These sort of things. That's what we're talking about, workplace fraud. That you could be working at McDonald's and stealing out of the cash drawer. And there's always victims in fraud, and it could be elderly victims, it could be young people. There's always a victim. So in investigating fraud, you want to make sure, how was the scheme conceived? It takes innovative. I've worked on some major cases. I worked on a case once where we had 80 targets in an insurance fraud, and they were staging automobile accidents. So they were also involved in healthcare fraud. And so it took a lot of innovation using undercover officers, undercover cooperating witnesses, electronic surveillance, and we solved the case, and it took a couple of years. But anytime when insurance fraud is successful, that means our rates are going to go up. So there's a real usefulness in doing and investigating those crimes. But many times there also are victims, and they could be elderly victims, as I talked about. And like any other investigation, you need to identify your victim, understand how the offense is being committed, meet the elements of the crime, develop evidence, identify witnesses, collect evidence, and then take these perpetrators to court. And then lastly, read about decoy vehicles. I think you've seen those on TV. It's kind of funny to watch these people get in these cars as they're trying to steal them, and then the police are watching them the whole time. I think I've talked enough about this chapter. It's a very, crimes these are all crimes that you've probably read about, but make sure you take your time to read through the chapter. There's a lot of good information on how to investigate these type of property crimes. That'll be the end of this dictation.